Hello, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. To give a little context to our discussion specifically today, I want to tell you a little bit about us because this certainly relates to our discussions. I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail during times of crisis. My experience with some of the wealthiest families in the world has allowed me to distill best practices for discovering purpose and refining vision, governance, structures, systems, processes, and the culture that successful families and their safeguard family offices need in order to thrive. I help families create or reinvent their family office to be of institutional quality and highly adaptive. My process engages all generations in the family and focuses on designing a generationally dynamic family office focused on people, systems, and technologies that aligns the desires and the capabilities of the rising generation to be able to triumph over challenges. Our podcast today is titled Why the World's Wealthiest Families Buy Banks and Businesses and Create Family Offices in Switzerland. Our special guest joining us today is Marnin J. He's a senior partner at Baker McKenzie. Marnin has been practicing for over 20 years in the areas of tax and international private banking. He handles insurance matters related to tax investigations and wealth management, as well as counsels clients on issues relating to U.S. withholding, qualified intermediary rule, and FACTA. He also advises on issues related to potential tax evasion and cross-border regulatory issues, as well as money laundering avoidance legislation. Marnin was a member of the firm's steering committee and has led the U.S. Department of Justice initiative for Swiss banks. In the end, the firm acted for 45 banks, and the project won the American Lawyer Magazine's Litigation Firm of the Year award in 2015. Marnin is widely regarded as one of the world's leading wealth management attorneys. Marnin, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are.
Yes, and if you couldn't tell from the title, maybe not from the accent, Marnin is in Switzerland, as I noted, and truly, when I ask around in my billion-dollar families, especially in Europe, about who's the person for me to connect with, by far the most common name that consistently came up was Marnin J. So it was an honor to be connected to him by a couple of mutual friends about a month or two ago. And really for me to learn. Many of you realize that I speak a lot about family offices becoming more global and considering banks, insurance companies, private placement life insurance, VC, meaning venture capital, and operating companies and structures to their family offices offshore. It does not mean they should always do it. They should be aware of it. And certain opportunities in Europe potentially could be very, very attractive. So really, it's a great pleasure. Marnin, let's get right to it. Families of wealth around the world are often active direct investors. What legal and country-specific considerations must these direct investing families consider when investing in countries outside their domicile, say in Europe, and the nuances of investing in Europe and specifically perhaps EU countries?
So, Angelo, thank you very much for having me. And I'll just say I have my colleague, Chelsea Hunter, also on the line today, who may jump in with a question. She's the other Marnin Michaels there, but I'll pull her in if needed. So let me start with the following. You know, particularly for people in the United States, and people in the United States are very fortunate that the market is so large and the opportunities for investment is so large within the US that they sometimes get so focused on that they assume sometimes the world works the same in the U.S. as it work, and it works the same everywhere else. The U.S. is a common law system, and yes, there are some variations. I know there's some civil law concepts there from places like Louisiana. But having said that, pretty much the U.S. system is pretty consistent throughout all of North America, from United States and Canada up, Mexico being more of the civil law system. But having said that, anytime there are real reasons people would like to do investments, particularly outside of their home jurisdiction, ranging from diversification to having some what they perceive to be safe harbor currencies or other things like that. However, having said that, sometimes people don't think about the consequences of it. Let me give you the simplest example: real estate. How many people would love to buy a piece of real estate in the south of France or in Italy, and just a family haven or a chalet in Switzerland? Well, first of all, we should make sure that you can actually do it, because many countries have restrictions on foreigners owning real estate, on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a whole other issue, which is the inheritance rules may work very, very differently. And for example, on the continent, you have a concept called compulsory share rules, or forced heirship, which means you may have a desire to send the assets to your spouse, but a third of the assets may automatically vest in your kids. And those kids may not even be kids that your spouse knows about, without even knowing about it. So it's very important to take into account the rules of the road before you get involved with it, because the standards can be very, very different as to what can and can't be done.
That's for sure. And related to that, I'd assume investing in direct companies abroad, that the investors should be familiar with the legal considerations in various countries, including nuances like labor practice, union considerations. And I had a specific story over the years of a successful American family that was active in the distillery business. I'm not going to mention the European country, but they purchased an entity in Europe without perhaps doing enough diligence on it. And it was incredibly unique about the number of days they were allowed to be open, very strict on union considerations. And they basically had to spend months and months and money and time of going there, negotiating with unions, negotiating with the government, showing that it was going to employ more people. They had to then increase their employment by like 30%. It was a lot of work. They didn't do that before, they did it after, and that always bites you in the butt.
So here's the challenge that I found with this issue, and I found it time and time again. There's a reason why investment bankers try to get a larger group of people looking at an investment other than from the home country. And that is because oftentimes they don't know how to value the asset. They put a multiple evaluation on the asset that isn't proportionate. For example, I know someone who bought a chain of restaurants. And when they bought the chain of restaurants, they didn't take into account that in certain European countries, they had to be closed 2 days a week. So their entire multiple for revenue was off, as an example. Another one is don't buy a pork farm outside of Jerusalem. It's not like you're going to have a lot of buyers for the pork. And so, I could use Saudi Arabia as the other example. But I've seen this time and time again where people take their own value systems and apply it to a business in another country. And they go to the lawyers, and the lawyers' due diligence in the home country under standards they're used to. And unless they're very sophisticated, they don't think about what's the difference between what they're used to and what you're used to. That often results in multiples for purchase being very different than what they should be, and oftentimes creates an overvalue, which makes it very hard to make money.
Getting a little bit into one of the core parts of the title of our conversation today, and to some degree how I queued it up and I kicked off, although it does sound a little old world, I've known significant families that have purchased banks or created them. There are benefits, which we'll get into shortly and get some of your feedback on, but the days of going and buying a bank and having it be completely dedicated exclusively to only that one family, you may be able to get away with that in parts of the Caribbean and parts of the world. But in Europe, specifically Switzerland, that probably in 20 years has not been the case. I'd assume this applies to many jurisdictions in Europe. as I've been talking more and more about banks, I'm just getting so many families that are saying, wow, I hear you talk about the benefits of bank. Could I create a bank in a Liechtenstein, in an Ireland, in specifically Switzerland, and have it be just dedicated to me?
So, Angelo, I'm not going to talk about the reasons why you'll do this, because that's actually a question down the line. But let me start by this. Most European countries now, including Switzerland, including Liechtenstein, including the EU, have a requirement that there be a certain number of customers at the bank. Now, it may be in fact that you may have enough people in your family that you can have more than 20 customers. But if you don't have 20 customers, no regulator here is going to give you a banking license first. Second of all, I would like to point another point here, and that is, if you buy a bank, there's a concept in every jurisdiction called fit and proper now by the regulators. And that means you have to be fit and proper to either work in the bank, be an owner of the bank, or be a director of the bank. And many jurisdictions, including in civil law jurisdictions, but also particularly Switzerland and Liechtenstein, as well as on the continent, they're very, very strict as to who they want owning a bank. They want people who understand the banking business. They want people who actually understand what they're going to do. They don't want people just buying it for the sake of buying it, because the next thing you know, they can't actually administer it and they're being taken advantage of, and then there's trouble. There's a pattern of this time and time again. Now, it may be possible for a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos or a Warren Buffett to buy a bank or insurance company in Switzerland. And it may be possible for someone with $300 to $500 million in assets to buy a bank in Switzerland or Liechtenstein. But the reality is, if you don't have that kind of money and you don't have experience in the financial services sector, the likelihood that the regulators will let you purchase it is very, very low, if not zero.
I would like to review, I think there's probably a dozen or so reasons, if not more, potentially of the benefits of owning a bank, even if it needs to be more of a quote unquote of a commercial enterprise. And by the way, sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. Building a business that could be successful, that's nothing wrong with that. But let me pick on 3 or 4 of the benefits from my perspective. And I know you may disagree a little bit on some of them, or they may be more specifically difficult in Switzerland. I'll start with the first one. A bank can be a safe haven for, quote unquote, the family's money. They control the risk policies of the bank. They can make it as safe as necessary. And people that have to keep their capital, their resources in other banks, do have to worry about bankruptcy risk.
So I'd like to break that down piece by piece, Angelo, if you don't mind. Okay.
Great.
Okay. So I want to be clear here. If you want protection from bankruptcy with a bank in Switzerland, all you have to do is not hold cash with the bank. Every actual asset of the bank is protected from bankruptcy of the financial institution. That's one. 2, if you want your cash protected, go to a cantonal bank, because the cantonal banks protect every wrap in there held. So you don't have that issue if you go to a Swiss bank. You don't really have, you can structure it so you don't have to worry about the bankruptcy of the carrier. It is true that if the bank does securities lending, if the bank does other items with your assets, like put them in fiduciary deposits, you could have risk, but you can control and monitor that. In my mind, the number one reason why an ultra high net worth family would buy a bank is for fear of forced repatriation. So let me give you a worst case scenario. A worst case scenario is Joe Biden's elected, the Democrats take a supermajority in the Senate and the House, and Joe Biden puts Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders as the Secretary of Treasury. Okay.
That's like a 90% tax bill we're going to have.
Okay. So it's not that, listen, that'll never happen, and I'm about as left-wing a communist as you'll ever find about tax policy and the like, which is sort of funny because I'm a tax lawyer. But having said that, the real reason why, and I've seen this not with the United States, but with other countries, why a family or a family group or a combination of family groups might wish to purchase a bank is to block forced repatriation. Now, what do I mean by this? let's say three families each contribute 50 million and purchase a bank, and they put in the capital of the bank of another 100 million into the bank. That 100 million is then the capital of the bank, which is required by law to be at the bank to keep the bank liquid. Let's say Secretary Warren in this orders a forced repatriation of all assets to the United States. Even if Secretary Warren would want to have the forced repatriation, you can't pull your assets out because you're under orders of a foreign country not to take the assets out. So you can't take the assets out. So if you're truly concerned about a forced repatriation order, it's not so much a US issue. I've seen this on many places. I've seen this is why South Americans buy the banks, why some of the wealthy South American families have purchased banks. It blocks the assets from being forced back to the home country. That to me is the number one reason why you would want to purchase a bank as a family. It is a method of keeping the assets. There may have been a time when buying a bank got you better fees than going to a bank, but to be fair with you, you don't set the risk bias of your bank. You don't set the risk profile of your bank. You know who sets the risk profile of your bank? Your regulator. So in the end of the day, in today's day and age, you may decide to be very, very aggressive, but don't assume your regulator is going to allow for that. So the bottom line is, what does it buy you? It buys you an extra level of security, meaning you control who's in the bank, who knows your information. You control maybe certain access to investments that you might not otherwise be able to get as a context of this, particularly if you're looking for the foreign non-US equivalent of an ISDA, which you might not be able to get otherwise. It's very interesting. Also, sometimes the ability to trade on currencies is usually a little better. These days, actual trading on the stock market probably isn't that much better, but possibly access to non-liquid assets like certain funds, you might get access in such a way that you wouldn't otherwise get because they're only open to financial institution type investors, and that does exist. That does make sense for me. But keep in mind, owning a business is only a financial institution, a bank, or an insurance company is a very expensive process. You need to have, it's a very expensive undertaking. You need to have quite a number of staff to run that. And they're not just going to let you have family members running in the bank. You need to have proper professionals in the business who actually know the business and have a history of running the business. They don't just let anyone go in and run a business. You might be able to bring a family member or two, but much else I don't think will work.
Can you bring the cash flows of a family's business that the family owns and have it kind of invested under one roof, allowing you to convert their operating cash flows into loanable money and better control of the businesses?
So can a bank be the financial arm of a family group? Absolutely. And I can give you countless very ultra high net worth families that have used their banks as the finance company of their financial group. And that does make sense, but you need to be a very large group, and you need to, I would actually argue with that case, you can be a bank, you can be a family that owns a bank, but you should not leave it only for your family. You won't be able to afford what's needed to do to make that work. The costs of doing it are too high, unless you got 6 billion or 10 billion to keep at the bank.
I think you hinted at it in one of your answers about 2 or 3 minutes ago, but I'll phrase it in case maybe perhaps the audience missed it. Would a bank give the family access to domestic and international payment systems, allowing them to move money around the world with greater ease, quickly, and with more control, and arguably less cost?
I would argue to you in today's day and age, that's gone. I would argue to you that there may have been a time when that was the case, but I can tell you, you as a financial institution might choose to be more lax with your KYC and your diligence. Not that your regulator will tolerate that for too long, but you might be. But your counterparties will not be. And the entire financial services system is based on correspondent relationships. And the minute you work with someone else, they want to know.
Switzerland is, of course, an iconic destination for banking. I'll start with the opportunity in Switzerland to buy a bank. Describe the opportunity and the process, and maybe we'll get to, for people could wrap their arms around it, what are the prices that banks are going for?
Okay. So right now, I would say to you is probably 10 to 15 banks on the market, at least. Maybe more.
Now, is that going to be the preferred option compared to starting one from scratch?
It's a very good question, and I'll answer that in a half-assed backward way to get you there. If you want to buy one, what you're doing is you're buying someone else's problem and someone else's issue. The going price for that will typically be 1% of AUM, and subtracted for that a cost for the liabilities, a cost for the liabilities. I know banks that have 2-3 billion AUM that you can buy for 20 million, but you're not effectively, you're buying the capital or some portion of the capital, or you're actually getting less than the cost of the capital because there are so many inherent liabilities in the bank that you're buying as well, and that's why they sell for that price. If you set up your own bank, you are starting from scratch, you have more options, and that clearly can be done. But the fundamental difference is when you buy a bank, you're buying a regulatorily approved financial institution from day one. When you want to set up a bank, you can have discussions with the regulators, you have to form the company, you have to capitalize the company, you have to get it up and running, and then maybe about a year later, you'll get the license if you're lucky, if not further on. And the chances of getting the regulators here are very clear. They don't want more banks. They want less banks. They don't want more small banks. They want to get rid of the smaller banks because the smaller banks have oftentimes not been profitable, and the regulatory problems tended to come from the smaller banks.
Usually
Look at example of the PD visa issues. It's a Venezuelan anti-money laundering issue, or any of those issues tend to go to the small banks because they're having a hard time staying around already. So they look the other way more often than not, and then they get themselves into trouble.
Would you say, from what you described, whether buying or starting from scratch and some of the capitalization, is that going to be relatively similar in Liechtenstein and Monaco, or is it a little extra difficult in Switzerland?
I would actually posit to you, if you think it's bad in Switzerland, multiply that by a factor of 5, and then you got Liechtenstein and Monaco.
That's what I thought. Liechtenstein's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, but there's a reason why. They're both European Economic Area, which means they're governed by European Union law, which means they not only, you have to remember, Liechtenstein, Monaco, Andorra have all worked super hard over the last 10 years to change their reputation. The FMA in Liechtenstein is super careful. The same is true in Monaco. It's also true in many of the Caribbean jurisdictions. The BMA, it's the same issue in Bermuda. They don't want problems. They want to avoid problems. So they are super careful. And there are so many issues that they're dealing with today from residual problems from the past.
And continuing, I might have jumped the gun a little bit. There are capital requirements if you're purchasing, and possibly that's going to be recapitalizing the bank. What can that range be? And will the family ever get that money back?
You should expect that if you're going to purchase a bank, you will need to bring the capital up to no less than 50 million Swiss franc, or at least 54, $55 million. Could be, depending on the size of the assets, and you could be much, much more than that, but 50 million is a baseline for capitalization if you want to be taken seriously first. And there's only one day in the bank's history when you'll get that money back. And that's when you sell when you sell the bank or you liquidate the bank. Now, I want to be clear. It's still capital of the bank. It's still investable. It still can be made to work for you. but and can be made to work for you, which means is if you take the 50 million and you invest it and you create proceeds from that, that's profits, and you can potentially take the profits out, or the regulator may require you to capitalize it and increase the capital of the bank. But it's still your money. It still can be invested. It still has to be invested within some level of reason. But yeah, in fact, when you look at what banks do, oftentimes they're making money on their own capital.
I want to go back a little bit to what you said earlier, that in your opinion, is perhaps the most powerful reason for a family to be a significant investor in purchasing or creating a bank, at least specifically in Switzerland, perhaps in other countries. And that's going to be some of the law, some of the issues regarding repatriation, like you mentioned in the example you gave with the US. I want to be very clear on that. So if the family has capital in the bank of $100 million, are they able to access the income from that? Are they able to access via loans if they needed some of that without technically withdrawing it?
So it's the bank's capital. The bank's capital is subject to regulatory requirements as to what you can do with the capital. Can it be invested? Yes. If you're over the thresholds required for the capitalization requirements, perhaps you can issue a dividend from the profits. If you're making a loan to the owners of the bank, it will be subject to regulatory scrutiny of a higher level. But so long as it makes economic sense, could you borrow? Yes, so long as it can be justified economically.
And given the fact that one family creating or buying a bank perhaps could be incredibly difficult, if not effectively impossible in certain countries, that may require several investors, not just one, buying a bank in Switzerland. Could 2, 4, 5 wealthy families band together, especially if one of them has banking experience? Would that help to make it a better purchaser to the regulators?
That will certainly help make it more. If you have a larger group and you have more capital and you have at least the lead having financial institution experience, that will always make it much easier to do.
You see some families that may band together, say 2 or 3 families that may have multiple branches, so it may hit that 20 or more clients that it's serving. But let's just assume they don't have that one family that has significant quote unquote banking or finance experience. Could they bring on someone who may be Swiss-based, who's a banker, and make them a 2 or 3% minority holder so they are an equity holder? Would that help to perhaps get something through?
It might, but to be fair, I wouldn't bring in the people as owners. I would bring the management team. I would prefer they not be owners. I would want the best quality management team you can find. But I will also tell you, let's say you brought in 3 families or 4 families, including one with banking experience, and there are these families that exist and everyone knows who they are and they do it very well. The cost of running that financial institution is so expensive that the likelihood that you can keep it only for the family is very, very low. I know I've heard of this situation many times where people said, we'll do this. Inevitably, they end up bringing in opening the bank up to the public or to a more group because it's not cost effective to run.
So let's say those group of families making the purchase is going to be looking for experienced people. If they're buying an existing bank, then possibly there may be some of those people in the bank. Now, we could argue if the bank is for sale, perhaps they're not doing a good enough job in management to make it profitable, and maybe you don't want to do that. We don't know the nuances of a given scenario. But relative to what I just said, and building out a team of, 3 or 10 or 12 people in the bank, that is going to cost millions and millions of dollars. And that goes back to what you said. It just may not make sense mathematically. Maybe for the families worth billions and billions and billions, but there's a limited number of those out there.
Well, I'll be open with you. If someone came to me and said, I want to buy a bank, and they were a family, and they were a family with, say, worth 300-400 million US dollars, I likely would say to them, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I make money on this, but I'm not going to do this. Don't feel I would be doing that family a service, and I would just have them upset with me. And I've seen too many examples where that's happened, and then 10 years later, you have a bankrupt bank. And I'll go something else. There may be quality people. I'm sorry, not that there may. There are quality people in the market, but those people are not working at the banks that can go for sale for $20 million.
Yes, rightfully so. There's a reason why it's so quote unquote discounted. It's not successful at all. We did cover the issue of some of your main reasons why, for some family groups, it may make sense to go and purchase a bank. But I think there also is is there an additional value of what I'm going to call family financial intelligence, simply having their ear to the grindstone of what's going on economically in Europe and in theory, because it's a bank around the world?
Well, actually, in fact, this goes into a whole other issue, which is why be in Switzerland? Now, I would posit to you the U.S. financial institutions are wonderful and very capable at accessing the U.S. capital markets. They are atrocious about dealing in other currencies and accessing other countries' capital markets. And further, because of securities regulations, there are a whole lot of funds and other types of opportunities for investment that never make it to the US. And legitimately don't make it to the US because you don't want to deal with the regulatory side of being in the US, which the good part of the US market is it's a great market, lots of access to cash. The negative of the US market is that it's a highly regulated market. And so the benefit of being, whether in Switzerland or Liechtenstein or Hong Kong, is you get more access to information that you might not otherwise have. You get more access to capital markets that you might not be able to access, and you might be able to, and in fact, I will know you'll be able to work in non-US currencies much easier.
Are there other wealth preservation benefits for a non-Swiss citizen or resident? The money to capitalize the bank and the internal growth of that is highly protected from creditors of the bank's owners, as we said earlier. What potentially, if it's even relevant, are some other wealth preservation benefits of bank ownership?
Well, let's start with, in my view, the number one, and that is if you're regulated by a regulator, you and your family are regulated by a regulator, you have already gone through a higher level of diligence than anyone can ever expect of you. And that can oftentimes make going through KYC in other parts of the world much easier to do.
Let's talk a little bit about a tremendous benefit. Benefit's a strong word. I'm going to reel that back in a little bit because it gets very complex. And that's going to be the tax benefits. And we're so pounded here in the US that the perception, which is 99% true, that the IRS will follow us everywhere. We're a US citizen, we need to pay taxes, but there are nuances. So if we could talk a little bit in banking of the growth on the bank balance sheet, does that grow tax preferred even for if it's owned by an American citizen?
So I want to be clear, and that is there is no longer such a thing as bank secrecy allowing you to hide your money. And that is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, as you, some of the people on this phone call, I'm sure are aware of, there are rules associated when US people buy non-US investments that cause the assets of those investments to be taxed in the US on an annual basis through laws like CFC, the Controlled Foreign Corporation rules, or PFIC, the Passive Foreign Investment Company rules, or the GILTI tax rules. One thing that is a bit unique is that a bank or an insurance company by statute cannot be a CFC, cannot be a PFIC, and cannot be subject to the GILTI tax. What does that mean? It means that if you own a bank or an insurance company, then the income earned in that bank or insurance company is not it's not subject to that. It may not even be subject to the same type of reporting rules associated with the CFC or PFIC, depending on the circumstances. Having said that, that doesn't mean there's not going to be reporting. There's absolutely going to be reporting on it. It's just under US rules, you'll get out of the reporting and the disclosure issues there.
It goes back to one of the questions I asked earlier, and you answered it, but we're going to maybe dive a little bit deeper into it. And basically, it's why are there banks in Switzerland and more than a dozen, like you said, for sale? I am assuming they haven't modernized their services and technology. They're antiquated, expensive models where people, even the super rich, are being very careful relative to their expenditures. They don't want to overpay for something. When I think of Switzerland, I think of, and maybe it's not true, but I think of the greatest banking system and banks in the world, yet there's relatively, for a small country, so many for sale. Why are there so many mismanaged banks?
Well, I think mismanaged banks would be an overstatement. I think Switzerland, unlike many other places of the world, had the private banking concept. And with the private bank, any family, historically, particularly a Swiss family, could open a bank, open it to the general public. You have many, many small banks. You have many banks with assets under management of 2-3 billion assets. Think about that. Just banks with assets under management of 2-3 billion. A mid-sized bank might have 20 billion. The big ones will have maybe 300-400 billion. Okay. In the US, can you think of the number of banks that have a couple hundred billion AUM? Very few. Most of them are much, 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 much larger. And let's also be clear, the regulatory burden on banks has gotten significantly higher in the last decade. Now, when there was a bank secrecy premium, banks in Switzerland could charge sometimes 20, 30, 50, 100% more than banks in other jurisdictions for the quote unquote secrecy premium, which allowed those banks to make money. But once those premiums are gone, and many of those banks did not modernize many years ago, they don't have IT infrastructures, and now you have a very aggressive regulator and very real requirements for lots of high tech and lots of technology, lots of more core system requirements. It's very hard to make money. And I actually had this argument, and I said, you got all these small and mid-sized banks in Switzerland, bring them all together into one great big bank, and actually having 10% or 5% of a large bank that has 150 billion AUM in it is probably a lot better than having 100% of a bank with 3 billion AUM in it. But ego has blocked that from happening.
Let us surprise. If 3 wealthy American families wanted to buy one of those banks that, again, you said may be as little as $20 or $30 million, but I did emphasize the word 3 American, would there be a little bit of skepticism from the banking authorities in Switzerland that we would really like to see one of the families be either a Swiss family, a European Union family? Okay, you're going to be hiring people of Swiss descent to be managing the bank, but the owners are going to be all American. Is that a little frowned upon, or is it possible as long as they have the right balance sheet?
I don't think a regulator here would care about the nationalities of the owners of the bank. I do think they'd want to make sure that they have the appropriate resources to keep the bank capitalized, and they have appropriate experience in the financial services sector to justify owning a bank. And further, they would want to make sure that there's no issues with fit and proper.
We're focusing heavily on Switzerland, and it is at our title. And again, when people around the world think of banking, I think Switzerland is still going to be number one that comes to their mind. I briefly mentioned 2 others that are, again, arguably far more difficult on regulatory with Liechtenstein and Monaco. But could we briefly discuss some other favorable banking jurisdictions around the world where families may have a little bit more freedom and flexibility, yet good contract law and systems and regulatory in place?
Certainly, I would say Barbados, I would say Bermuda are jurisdictions that are going to be easier. Some of the protectorates, like in Jersey and Guernsey, Isle of Man, may be more sympathetic. Gibraltar, be more sympathetic. You might be able to pull it off in Luxembourg, UK, Ireland, or Hong Kong, or Singapore, but what they're going to require is much more institutional ownership.
Among the ones you mentioned, probably the one that I just didn't see coming out of, as we would say here in America, left field, was Barbados. Mm-hmm. Why Barbados?
Barbados has a really good treaty network. It has for taxes. It has a very good treaty network for reinsurance. It has a very good treaty network for investment protection agreements. And Barbados has actually been going out and looking for this type of business.
Would a Barbados, or one of the countries that you noted, or maybe a country that's going to be on that second or third tier, be potentially open to a bank dedicated just to one investing family and servicing that family only?
You're going to be much more likely to do Barbados.
That's what I would think. Mm-hmm. Becoming a citizen of Switzerland is complicated and very time consuming, and 10 years. Discuss other options for, I guess you could say, residency or citizenship, or explain to our audience the difference, whether it be Cyprus, Ireland, etc.
Okay, so I want to bifurcate two topics. Topic number one is where you live. Topic number two is the passport you hold. And there are many jurisdictions where you can get relatively easy a right to live in the country. And oftentimes at a tax preferred rate, whether that's Switzerland with its lump sum regime, its forfait or Pauschalbesteuer regime, but that's going to cost someone who's not an EU national $500,000 a year. You can move to Italy for €100,000 a year. Spain or Portugal is actually not so bad. Singapore, they have a remittance-based tax system of taxation. Even the UK, for a period of time, has a remittance-based system of taxation, which means that you're only paying tax on what you bring into the country. Hell, even Israel has a 10-year tax holiday for people if they want to live there. That's one topic. Now, with respect to the passport, well, the first thing I always tell people is look at your family history. One of the neat things about the United States is almost everyone has someone who came from somewhere. And if it isn't that long in advance, that far behind, oftentimes there may be a way to get a nationality based on family history. That's sometimes very good. This week, Cyprus was shut down because of perceived abuse. Malta apparently may reopen as early as 2 weeks from now or so for their nationalities. The benefit of those jurisdictions is their EU passports. Macedonia is a European jurisdiction that is not part of the EU, that uses the euro, and it is perceived that it will be the next entry to the EU, which is why you see people looking at that. Could you try to get Austria? Yes. Is it extraordinarily hard? Yes. Will you hate me at the end of the process? 100%. And I don't guarantee I'll succeed on that one. Yeah, but the thing is, you can have a passport, but if you had a US passport and then you're going to say, I want to use another passport, you don't realize how easy it is to travel on a US passport. And then to swap it for St. Kitts and Nevis, I'm not sure is always the greatest option. Although I must say, I know many people who are living functionally on it, but it's not perfect. To me, at least if you have a European residency somewhere in the EU, then you have the right to travel freely within the EU without much of a headache, which is quite nice. But I would like to bifurcate the two. You can easily get a residency in a place on a tax preferential place, but working on the passport, I actually tell people, you know what, screw the taxes for a while, pay a little bit more taxes, move to the Czech Republic, move to Belgium, because in those jurisdictions, you can get passports in about 3 years. Even I think Bulgaria is 3 years as well, if you move there and you pay full taxes. So at least then you pay full taxes, you can get the citizenship if you really are living there for a period of time. The reason I like Prague is actually it's a fun place to live and it's actually quite nice. Belgium's okay to live and you can get the passport, even if you're going to pay more taxes for a while. And then of course you can then move to Switzerland or Italy or another place where it's more preferential.
And although we didn't discuss it, although I noted it, if you could explain to the audience why thinking that you could get citizenship in Switzerland, it's a incredibly long and onerous process and likely not going to be the right choice for many people from an international perspective looking in.
First of all, you have to live here for 10 years before you can you have to be here before you can even be accessible to get citizenship. That's a long time. And by the way, it used to be when I moved here, it was 12. So it's gotten a little bit easier first. Second of all, there are language tests, cultural tests, history tests, and all sorts of fun things that you have to go through. And lastly, if you're in Switzerland and you're in Switzerland on the lump sum regime, the Pauschalbesteuer forfait, whatever magic word you want to use for it, once you are a Swiss national, you're no longer eligible for that tax regime.
Very interesting. Non-Swiss citizens, yet globally successful families, have for decades placed their assets, their gold in Switzerland. I'm going to get around my question a little bit indirectly. One of the things that we see among highly sophisticated families in the States, because of various regulations and laws here in the United States, possibly some families of great wealth may want to set up irrevocable trust actually in one of the destinations that you noted, a Nevis or a Cook Islands, where it's difficult not to avoid taxes from a perspective of litigation, of challenges, of lawsuits. It's just very hard, especially with an irrevocable trust with trust protectors, to go to that country to win. However, families have told me, I'm a billionaire, we're doing that for some of our trust and resources, but honestly, we don't quite trust Caribbean islands of putting hundreds of millions of dollars literally custodied there. So what they do is they custody the assets in whatever, in Switzerland or a different country, maybe Hong Kong, Singapore, etc. Effectively, I guess in the US, we would call that a foreign asset protection trust. How common is that as a wealth preservation strategy?
So I'd like to point out, I think there's a misunderstanding about these asset protection strategies. If you want the Cook Islands to work for you, you got to keep the assets in the Cook Islands. The minute you have them outside, you have to assume that wherever you've placed them, like Switzerland or Andorra, or wherever you're choosing to be, that the creditor is going to go to that jurisdiction where the asset is to take the assets. So yes, it can work. Yes, it might be interesting, but I think you need to be very realistic about the minute you place the assets there. And where is this really important? Let's say you have an issue with matrimonial regime, or maybe you have a child out of wedlock that the assets in Switzerland. The Swiss courts will not care that there's a trust on top. They're going to say the assets are here, our laws apply, and we respect compulsory share rules, and we're going to give the assets. So that's always the risk with having the assets in a jurisdiction like Switzerland. Now, having said that, you might want to be in Switzerland because you want safety and security. You want it a little harder for people to know the assets. Now, while bank secrecy is dead for tax purposes, once the taxes are paid, Switzerland's bank secrecy is very effective for all other purposes. So that's also quite helpful. That's very important for people. Now, in that regard, I will say you want to be in Switzerland because you get access to crypto less complicated. You get access to other currencies. You get access to other fund management vehicles that may be available. And that's why you do it.
I think my last question, then we have a couple that came in via the chat feature. So let me get right to it. We do see global families in the past that have set up their single family offices, say in New York City, mainly to be close to the action, the financial epicenter, talent and resources dedicated to that family office. But in today's world, COVID-19, remote work, in theory, I could be anywhere in the world, greater use of technology, more of quote unquote a flat world. It would be possible for a US-centric family to do the opposite of what I just described, with international families coming here, which could still be great for international families. But a US family could set up a for-profit single-family office in Switzerland, kind of for those same reasons why I mentioned international families may want to do it here in the US. They want Swiss talent dedicated to having more diverse opportunities available to them and being at the epicenter of Zurich and other quote unquote banking communities in Switzerland or in some of the other countries that we noted. How common or how difficult is it for an American citizen to set up their single family office in Switzerland or some other recommended European countries that you're familiar with?
That's the future. Single family offices for a single family, that is quite common. It is quite common, and it's not even have to be something you have to worry about for profit. In fact, because it's quite common because you don't have to have a lot of assets in the company. You can have the account in the name of the family, but that is what you're seeing now. You're seeing many people, like the same reason they want to be in New York and London, be in Switzerland or Hong Kong, to get access to the capital markets that exist there and the opportunities that exist as a result.
And one question that came in by text, because I talk so much about it, I don't think we have the time to do a really deep dive, and I have covered it before with even some people in Switzerland. I've been a big advocate of private placement life insurance. Yeah. Mm-hmm. My audience already knows a lot of the benefits, the death benefit, the tax favor, the trust aspect of it. If you're using it more for alternative assets that are taxed inefficiently, how it grows tax favored, how it's first in, first out, how wash loans. It's an amazing laundry list of benefits to private placement life insurance. Yet, Marnin, for some reason, we've been talking about this for 20 years. It just never really takes off. Why hasn't this incredible vehicle taken off as much as perhaps we think it should? What's holding it back?
So members of my team and I have actually been very much involved in designing much of the product that's out there today. Not everyone, but it's there. There's a reason why. There's a reason why it hasn't taken off the way people would like it to be. Because you have to have death benefit, and death benefit is expensive. And even if you use frozen cash value or zero cash value, death benefit is expensive. Second of all, you have to limit how you control your investments, and that always has an effect. And even if you use a zero value policy, you have. Third, you don't own the assets. The carrier owns the assets. So I'm a big believer in VUL. I'm a big believer in PPLI. I'm a big fan of it. I've designed my products. If I could do it myself, I had enough money to do it, I would absolutely do it. But there's a corresponding situation, and that is the more you're an entrepreneur, the less you're willing to give up control time and time again. And once you're in VUL or PPLI, we're giving up an element of control, and that's why I think people have a hard time with it. I think, honestly, I think people tried to use it for things that they want the control over. I actually have a different theory. If you diversify your assets and you put a portion in PPLI, it makes sense. The largest PPLI product that my team ever did is we put 1.8 billion into it, but we had to use 14 carriers to do it. And even then we had issues with the reinsurance.
Yeah, that's the challenge for the multi-billion-dollar families. Is I'm not going to quite use the word a drop in the bucket, but depending on the number of family members, their insurability, what's going on in the reinsurance markets. Again, I know we're talking rarefied air here with probably the Forbes top 100 families around the world. It's only a drop in the bucket. But it all adds up with other strategies in place. I had one U.S. family show me the benefits of, we want to create captive insurers offshore, reinsurance company, and I got it. And there still are some benefits left for American citizens, but they're getting more narrow. But I looked at them and I asked them, what are you looking to accomplish? And then I turned and I said, do you know what private placement life insurance is? I think it's so much easier than the complexities of what you're looking to do with insurers, captives, and reinsurance companies. Oh yeah, one of our advisors said it's not worth it. Now, that's the other issue, is I think advisors are not familiar with it. And if they're money managers, they may not be incentivized because they're going to lose a part of their AUM that potentially is going into the insurance product. In other words, it's an ugly subject, but
the money manager could probably manage the money for the carrier too.
Yeah, sometimes. But I do think that there's a conflict of interest in the community with the advisory community that often, and maybe the complexity, because it is a little complicated. I don't think as complicated as reinsurers in that, but it could get a little deep. On that note, though, I did promise the audience I would get to some of their questions. This one's an interesting one, Marnin. I'm going to read it. With the rise of digital currencies, stable coins, central bank digital currencies, it's a comment. He goes, banks will become as plentiful and useful as blockbuster video stores. Is there a grain of truth in what he's saying?
Listen, there's a grain of truth in what everyone says. But I also have to say, and I have the benefits of being both things. You have financial institutions here. You also have Zug being Crypto Valley now.
True.
So we have both here. I posit to you that some of the banks that exist today will not exist, but I also believe some of the banks will evolve as well. And I've heard this over so many industries over so many years that something will go, the way of Blockbuster or Borders Books. It doesn't always happen that way.
And it looks like the last question, then we'll wrap up. What would be the reasons for a family, this participant asked, to establish a relationship with a Swiss bank or another jurisdiction, perhaps Singapore, in lieu of buying a bank?
Okay. Well, to me, if you're a family that can be on this call, having a relationship outside the U.S. properly disclosed, properly reported is not something you should consider. It's a must. Why is that? Because when you look at the U.S. banks, they are phenomenal about getting you access to the U.S. capital markets and phenomenal about trading and getting you access to dollar-denominated vehicles in the U.S. What they do atrociously is get you access to the non-U.S. capital markets and give you access to owning assets in other currencies or holding other currencies. And in this respect, I have to say, whether it's Switzerland, London, Singapore, or Hong Kong, those institutions do a phenomenal job in that area.
Indeed. Marnin, for those that have an interest that will either hear this live or watch it on a upcoming video or perhaps my Apple podcast, and they want to learn more about you, is there a way that they can learn more about the firm, and how could they reach out specifically to you?
So my name is Marnin Michaels. My colleague Chelsea is on the line. We're Baker McKenzie in Switzerland. I have the benefit of having a name Marnin. So just put the name Marnin into Google and you'll find me, because it's that unusual name.
And yeah, that actually is true. I know, because I've done it. So again, that's Marnin Michaels at the iconic law firm Global of Baker McKenzie. And Marnin, it's been great. I do have to do a brief close. I don't think it'll take more than a minute, so maybe just pardon me. Everyone, this was a lot of fun. Many of you heard me talk about banks, insurance companies, and I pounded it over and over and over, but I kept away from doing a little bit of a deep dive for a variety of reasons. One, I think some of it is very private, and I really keep it dedicated to my members and my consulting relationships, but I wanted to open it up a little more broadly and bring in truly one of the world's great leaders, in Marnin, specifically to his area in Switzerland. And since when people think of Switzerland, often they think of banks. It just simply made sense. And he's been wonderful. And I hope this has been insightful on more than just banks, although that was certainly a core part of it. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast, and I'm the founder and CEO of Family Office Association. We're a global membership organization dedicated to families of great success and their single family offices. We do a significant amount of original proprietary content, host global programming, a bit on hold because of COVID, but we now host hundreds of times a year online digital events and meetings. We're incredibly active with our membership. We're active with our connectivity, a peer-to-peer connectivity among like-minded families, and our masterclasses. We've never been busier. You can learn about us on our website, familyofficeassociation.com, and my direct email, and my name's a bit unusual too, so it helps, is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Marnin, thanks for being such a great guest. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Have a great night. Bye.